Louis Bunuel is the most compelling director to read about, to read analysis of their work, but this isn't to say that he is the most compelling director to actually watch the films of. We are yet to discuss Bunuel in this program, and I am immensely fond of Bunuel. I do find his films exciting, beguiling, atmospheric, and rewarding upon rewatches. An appreciation of Bunuel really means that there's no going back in your self-destructive film obsession. Nazar and onward is one of the best runs in the history of cinema. I like everything he did from that feature onward, and a couple handfuls of them before that also. Viridiana, highly literary, could have made a relatively iconic novel, but more might have been lost in translation if it was just text, to non-Spanish speakers. The visuals allow those outside the language barrier to potentially appreciate this narrative project also. It's something important. Buñuel is considered a very radical, sort of edgy, subversive filmmaker, but looking at a film like Viridiana now, it's hard to imagine a contemporary effort at something subversive, edgy, politically, something to upend the system would look like Viridiana. Viridiana actually seems almost formalist, sort of old world now, like something that would be accepted into a more conservative canon. For Buñuel, he is operating on a different pathos for what we might term alternative cinema. Buñuel was considered very radical at one time. He might still be. Maybe in his lifetime he was considered more radical earlier on. I swear I remember reading about how those who fought Andalusian Dog was just a massive subversive event, really let down by the following work, L'Age d'Or, The Golden Age, and rioted at a premiere because they thought it was a bit more traditionalist. I could be totally mistaken on that, so I shouldn't have really said it aloud, frankly. But anyway, although, yeah, like I said, it is quite difficult to imagine someone in a radical context today making films that resemble Buñuel from any period, from the surrealist era, the earlier surrealist era to the maybe not the neorealist film, well, like The Young and the Damned in the 50s, but some of those 70s films, those would be considered, they're about the bourgeoisie, famously, but they would be considered films made by the bourgeoisie now. They wouldn't be made by political radicals today. They'd be considered too sort of literary and sort of, but they would be appreciated by a populist base, I suspect. This is something that academic sort of literary journal Marxism had to reckon with for a long time. It's what the recently deceased Michael Parenti, he used to critique them as more academic than Marxist, and there might have been some truth in that, because even Perry Anderson, though I'm sure Parenti would have felt that someone like Perry Anderson was guilty of this, someone like E.P. Thompson felt Perry Anderson famously was guilty of this. Perry Anderson's a very good writer, and I've read quite a bit of his stuff, as some of you may know in this channel, but there is a tension there where I'm reading Perry Anderson and I'm thinking, because Perry Anderson's taking sort of talking about how academic Marxism was being taken a little bit to task in the 70s for not operating enough in a sort of revolutionary praxis in practice on the ground, and Anderson might have been right about that, but how much did Anderson actually participate in those movements? Because Thompson certainly did. In the labour movement, and certainly in the last decade of his life, the nuclear disarmament movement. Anyway, that's a bunch of terrible improvising. But because today, actually, one sooner imagines a slightly conservative student of 20th century art history making Buñuel's films today, rather than an artistic or political or radical otherwise, frankly. But at one time, the political radical left, more so, not across the board. There were Maoist or otherwise Marxist-Leninist fanatics who refused to read anything except dry socialist literature about urban guerrilla strategy, nothing other than that. At one time, that political left prided itself on knowing its art history, on being cultured, on literary formalism and things that might potentially be dismissed as bourgeois culture. Because I guess that's the other tension, is a lot of Marxists and political radicals after the Second World War, they seem to emerge a lot more from the middle classes and the upper classes too, rather than the working classes. And not that, obviously, we know where Marx and Engels, we know what class they originated from. Someone like Rosa Luxemburg even came from I think it was, maybe it was more middle class, but she wasn't from a working class background. I think some of the Bolsheviks were from not the most prosperous backgrounds, to be fair. I think Trotsky as a kulak was slightly better off, but really not overwhelmingly so. I can't imagine compared to the aristocracy in Russia, of course. But that goes without saying. But the point I'm making is it's sort of fitting that those who are from sort of upper middle class or more bourgeois, petty bourgeois cultures, even though they consider themselves radical, they maintained an appreciation of sort of more, if you want to call it artistic formalism, or that sort of tradition, and sort of carrying radical politics through that tradition, and insisting it's radical, even if, like, to the working classes, that to them it was just all bourgeois art. But anyway, put it like this: Terry Eagleton would have felt like less of an outlier at one time. Put it like that. And honestly, in my opinion, he shouldn't be. It didn't make Straub or Huye any less radical, Goddard any less radical, doesn't make Costa Gavras any less radical for having a deep, passionate knowledge of the history of human culture, whether it was the domain of the elites or not. Radical might be a misnomer. It didn't make them complacent or crypto-conservative, petty bourgeois, whatever term you prefer to use. In my opinion. But, it is difficult to imagine showing the average person Viridiana and them getting it, that is, really appreciating it. They might assume it is some analogy for the first half of the 20th century in Spanish history. They really wouldn't be wrong, but they mightn't enjoy it so much. Some art student type might pretend to because they want to, but only because they heard that it was a vaunted classic. I didn't appreciate it when I first saw it. I did appreciate Bunuel. I was quite an admirer of Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie, Exterminating Angel, L'Age d'Or, and Simon of the Desert, though Viridiana seemed either too creepy, too much of a political statement that required context to really adore, or too much dialogue and soft-spoken attempts at existentialism. Now I look at it and I see a very conscious attempt for its players and their behaviours to be demonstrating some higher significance about the culture it is set and made amongst, and their decisions on display clearly being more than just surface-level human dramatics. In this sense, Viridiana can be a compelling mystery to speculate over, but also when observing it as a highly visual, assertively filmic endeavour, Viridiana appears one of the most captivating acts of film direction ever achieved as of its year of release, 1961. So insofar as I'm a hack filmmaker admiring someone with probably more originality, especially relative to the era in which they were operating, than I or anyone else will ever show of this medium, I'm a great fan now of Viridiana, although it's difficult to imagine either non-filmmakers or those who aren't avid readers of the canonical adulated novels to really appreciate this film. Really. If you feel inclined to comment, I'm curious, did you buy into this film's canonical status, or was this one of those films you felt on the outside looking in, a snooty little culture of art students appreciating the cinematic equivalent of literary formalism, or literary formalism on film just in and of itself, admiring things their educators or other posers on forums just told them to admire? Is this just a film for upper-middle-class pseudo-intellectuals who couldn't name more than 3 elements on the periodic table, or learn the principles of civil engineering? As far as this film being down-to-earth, or politically serious, or relevant, something which feels timelessly authentic, and not just some fodder for rich people to appreciate and feel cultured, I will say that I can't bring myself to describe this film as populist, although I don't believe that this has to diminish the personal politics of its director, those who admire this film, or in general this old world of slightly formalist, elegant, vaguely baroque works of art, which are consciously acknowledging the history of the artistic canon leading up to it, as well as seeking to move forward or break from it. And the old guard of the time did despise it. Bunuel, Goddard, and René, however formal they appear now, they were certainly loathed by the formalists of their own era. The world of art can be considered innately revolutionary in and of itself, regardless of whether the bourgeois world just uses these things to affirm that they're not like the other guys or girls, whatever the fig. read Marcuse as the aesthetic dimension for greater articulation on this point, though Marcuse is considered bourgeois escapism for many who consider themselves serious leftists, to be fair, although I am an admirer of some of Marcuse's texts, personally. Yeah, let's close it here. On the next video for AOD, we'll be going back a few years from 1961, the middle of the previous decade, the 1950s.